Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. It is just myself tonight, running solo. I tried this before with Chris Painchab, and that was one of the two lost episodes we talked about last episode, so I'm cautiously optimistic, though, because our guest tonight has a solid internet connection, and hopefully all will be well. So the guest tonight is Roy Blodgett. Did I say that right?
You did, yeah.
Blodgett, yeah. All right, good.
As far as I know.
Yeah, there you go. From, I just forgot the name of your Wellsprings Herpetology?
Yep. Yeah, Wellsprings
All right, there we go.
Yep.
Yes.
Nailed
and a lot of people have asked for a Spilotes episode, and the two names popped into my head. One was definitely Roy, and the other one was Jason Hood, and we have every intention of having them both on. And what's kind of awesome is that Roy and Jason, I know that they respect each other, and I also know that they keep in two different ways. So you're going to get very different perspectives on Spilotes, which is awesome because you're going to get the full gamut by doing it this way, which is something that I always like to do, present the variety of how we go down with this. Now, I talked to Jason at Tinley, and he said that he was more than willing to come on, and hopefully that will come to fruition. Normally we do the banter, but I don't have my co-host to do the banter with, so I guess I'll just do a couple little odds and ends that I totally forgot to talk about on the last episode. One thing that I can do is a book update, because the book that will not die still's breathing. It's not been sent out to the publisher yet. We had a development, which was Mark O'Shea has agreed to write the foreword, but he also said that he was going to review the entire book. And it's kind of crazy having one of your childhood heroes review your first book. That was a surreal moment for me, because truth be told, back in the day, the early 2000s, you had the choice of Mark O'Shea's Big Adventure, and then you had Steve Irwin with Crocodile Hunter. And I was in grad school, undergrad, when Mark O'Shea was on, and I fully 100% was an O'Shea geek over Irwin. Like Irwin, but I like Mark O'Shea better. So the fact that he's read this book and his fingerprints are all over it, I think it makes it that much better. But what I did learn is that I had some of my systematics and taxonomy a little bit off, so I've been cleaning that up. And then when you have somebody from Great Britain review your American writing, there's basically a culture clash there, and I went with the Brits' way of writing over the American way, so I'm got some grammar and things like that I got to clean up, and I'm doing that actually this break. So all of the proposed revisions have been done, except for my Phylodryas chapter, which taxonomy with that group is a literal nightmare. And thank God O'Shea does what he does and helped me clean up. I had a bunch of questions for him. Some of the decisions I made were correct. Some of them were woefully incorrect. Not like a little bit incorrect, but choosing a genus, and I chose the wrong one, and I understand why now and learned, and that's what's the best thing about this entire process. I think the world really needs to be able to take some constructive criticism again. And I teach my students that, and I've certainly done it. And the product of it is, I was proud of the book before, but now it's like next level. So got to get that thing done, and hope to have it sent to the publishers and in print by, Russ and I have an ambitious goal, but we think we can have the whole thing wrapped up by the March Tinley. So I might be at Tinley, may not be at Tinley, but hopefully the book's at Tinley. So that's kind of our goal, to have everything done and ready for. So that's that. And then the other bit of news that I have, we won't be recording next week. It's right before Thanksgiving. That field station that my university is building in Costa Rica, I get to go down there all next week. It's kind of a work trip, so we're like planning, and I'm going to be like 10 feet away from a jungle working on a computer, which seems kind of sinful. But we got to get all the plans and documents and everything done, and you you can't do that stuff. There's a certain point when doing things with Zoom and email, it just becomes an inefficient piece. So I'll be down there, and hopefully I get to see a snake or two. So that's my 2 updates. So other than that, we're just going to jump right in this go around. So Roy, how you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really honored to be here.
Yeah, no. Roy and I have communicated off and on. The book I was just talking about has a big, chunky, burly Xenodon chapter for Xenodon poulter, and that's one of the species that Roy keeps. I love the way Roy keeps them with his naturalistic enclosures, and Roy might have more than a handful of pictures in that chapter. So, but no, we're not going to be talking about tricolors tonight, though. We'll save that for another episode.
Sounds good.
We are definitely going to be talking about Spilotes. So before we get into that, I know you've been on several podcasts, and I know that you have kind of this interesting herpetoculture backstory, but I think it's been a little while since you were on a podcast and kind of told the story, because I think the story is really interesting, because it's actually somewhat similar to my backstory, where I was in herpetoculture, I left, and then I came back in, and I feel like I came back in, I don't want to say better, but at the same time, better, more prepared, more mature. I don't know what the hell the word is. So why don't you just kind of give everybody your backstory and how you ultimately ended up being kind of geared towards these snakes that you work with?
Yeah, okay. So I grew up in a household with a lot of animals. My dad was a reptile keeper. He had a really eclectic collection. He also had a bunch of tarantulas. And I think at one point we had something like 65 animals in the house. So it was just kind of there for me. It was in the water, that I was swimming in. And my first pet was a California king snake. One of my earliest memories was being 3 years old. My dad bought me this little California king at a reptile show. And, so, growing up even just as a little kid, reptiles were around, herpetoculture was happening, or at least reptile keeping was happening. And, in entering into my teenage years, it kind of accelerated for me, and I really started to get deeper into it, and really wanted to learn how to breed reptiles. I had 10 years worth of Reptiles magazine issues that my dad was a subscriber to, that I read every single one cover to cover over and over and over again until they were just shredded. And I started breeding bearded dragons and a couple other, random reptiles here and there. But I was developing a pretty strong interest in big neotropical colubrids. So yellow-tailed crebos, black-tailed crebos, spilotes, Sustes, and I spent a lot of time on the Indigo forum on kingsnake.com, which was kind of the center of gravity of that community at that time. This was around 2005, 2006. And I remember coming across someone posting about their Spilotes sulphureus, and I had never seen this species before up to that point, except for I think in a couple images from that Into the Fields column that was on Reptiles magazine, and which was my favorite part of the magazine, and I was just blown away. At this time, those snakes were classified as Sustes sulphureus, and were also grouped alongside Sustes poecilonatus, which is now Phrynonax, and all these kind of arboreal, big eyes, sight-oriented colubrids really drew my attention. And not long after that, I had an opportunity to purchase a pair of 1.1 pair of sulphureus that had came up on the kingsnake.com classifieds. And this time I was, I guess I was 15 or 16 years old. And it was a pretty unforgettable experience receiving that box and just opening up this box and having this 9-foot yellow male sulfurius come out, just full threat display, puffing up, trying to bite my face. Just, it was like, holy moly, I've never seen anything like this before. And within a week of having those snakes, I realized that the female was gravid.
Whoa.
So these were both wild caught, imported snakes that were fresh off the boat pretty much when I got them. And so this female had come in gravid, and I kind of had this moment of just like, holy crap, like I'm about to receive eggs from these snakes. And at that point, only one person that I know of in the U.S. had hatched those snakes, and his name's Tom Davis. He had hatched them, I think, the year before, or maybe a couple of years before. He had hatched one clutch at that point, and so these were kind of like totally unknown snakes for the most part. And I had actually never hatched eggs from a snake at that point. I had hatched a lot of lizard eggs, but never snakes, and I was excited and terrified. And I remember, reaching out to a lot of the guys on that forum for advice, and a few of them really helped me out in terms of getting those eggs set up for success. And I hatched them after 97 days of incubation. All of them hatched using a little Hoverbaiter chicken incubator, and that was like a completely life-changing moment for me. I was living in a trailer park with my mom in the city, pretty poor, not the easiest life circumstances. And, I just remember like every single day checking that incubator 2 or 3 times a day to see any movement on those eggs. And, I remember getting ready for school and going to check the incubator out the door and seeing, a little cut in one of the eggs, and just being like, I'm not going to school today.
Yeah.
And my mom was like, no problem. That's fine. This is important. And I just sat there and just waited for the eggs to hatch. And, over the following, 24, 48 hours, all of these eggs hatched, and these beautiful little black and white snakes, or black and gray snakes, emerged from these eggs. And it was a profound experience. And I just remember being really keenly aware at the time, seeing those eggs hatch, that very few people ever had witnessed that before, and that I was really fortunate to have that experience. And so that was a huge moment. And honestly, not so long after that, within 6 months of that, or maybe even a shorter time frame, things kind of deteriorated for me in my living situation at home. And I kind of was just in a predicament where I kind of had to get out of that environment and get out on my own. And that meant finding homes for all my animals. And so I kind of hastily gave away and sold all of my reptiles, including all the baby sulfurius, and kind of quietly just disappeared from herpetoculture, and spent the next 10 years, basically all of my 20s, essentially, just kind of taking care of myself, learning how to be an adult. And after that 10-year hiatus, I should also say that a lot of that time I was kind of focused on developing naturalist skills and kind of ecological literacy. And I was doing a lot of wildlife tracking, and just spending a lot of time outside by myself, and doing a lot of field herping. And around I think it was late summer of 2018, I started to kind of get the itch again, and was kind of like, I think I'd like to keep a couple snakes and see how it goes again. It was a really painful experience, and I on some level, I would even say kind of traumatic, dismantling my collection the way that I had to, and kind of getting out of the hobby. And also, I think at that time, I was in over my head, as a teenager, working with a bunch of really big, complicated species to work with, and it was definitely too much. And so I remember being really keenly aware of that when I was starting to think about getting back involved. But I felt like, okay, I'm in a much better place in my life. I'm an adult. I have some income, and so I was like, well, if there's a species I want to keep, it's Spilotes sulphureus, and it was like I was just that image of seeing those eggs hatch was just seared in my mind, and so I Googled, like, is anyone working with these snakes, and I quickly found Jason Hood. At this time, I wasn't even on Facebook or anything like that, so I didn't even know Facebook was like where the herp community had coalesced at that point. It was kind of a surprise when I learned that. Yeah. But I emailed Jason and said, hey, this is who I am, and are you still working with these snakes? Are you having any success with them? And I also kind of offhandedly was like, also, do you happen to know this guy, John Anderman? Because I knew that John had ended up with a couple of the babies, or with one of the babies that I had hatched. And I was just wondering if he was still working with snakes. And so Jason wrote me back, I think within like a couple hours, and was like, I know exactly who you are. I tried to find you a few years ago, and we all thought you were dead.
There you go.
And he's like,
Nice.
I thought you were an old guy. I didn't realize you were a young guy. Your name's Roy, and
yeah,
which I get a lot, And he's like, and yeah, I know John, and he had CC'd John on the email and said, look, Roy's back from the dead, and and sure enough, John wrote back and he said, yeah, Roy, I have one of those snakes that you hatched, and now it's 10 feet long, and
nice.
It's the biggest, as far as we know, the biggest Spilotes in captivity right now, and an absolute beast, puppy dog tame. And so it was also just like kind of this amazing experience of like kind of immaculate timing, because literally like within a few weeks of me sending that email, John had decided that he wanted to move along that snake that I had hatched and another that he had purchased from Tom Davis to pair with it, because he just hadn't had any success breeding them. And for those who don't know who John Anderman is, he doesn't have a huge social media presence or anything like that, but he has been the man for Spilotes for a long time.
Yep.
And particularly the Tamaulipan locality of Spilotes mexicanus, the northernmost species, which are also the rarest and kind of most coveted in herpetoculture. So for him to not be having success with them was just pretty aberrant. And ultimately, long story short, he sent me those snakes, and I got to receive this snake that I had hatched.
That's crazy.
11 years prior. Yeah, which was just crazy timing. And I soon learned not long after that the other snake, the reason why they hadn't been breeding was because they were both males.
Well, there you go. That's a problem.
That was a problem. And so I learned that because keeping them together, I kept them in this kind of interesting vivarium, kind of modeled after John's vivariums, where he kind of keeps them in a 2-level animal plastics setup with a pass-through between them that he can open up or close. And so when I opened up that pass-through, I was noticing some really interesting behavior that looked kind of like combat. At first I was like, is this courtship or what's happening? My big male was chasing the other one and kind of they were doing the whole arm wrestling thing, and pinning, and a little bit of tail biting happening, and I was like, this isn't going well, and ultimately I sexed that other snake and was like, yep, sure enough, it's a male. So I ended up finding another home for that guy because I didn't have room for two big males. This other snake was approaching 10 feet as well, and kind of began searching in earnest for an adult female Spilotes sulphureus, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing to find.
Easy to find.
Yeah, and and I think it was maybe 6 months later or something like that. One popped up on Fauna Classifieds, and I bought it immediately. A wild caught import, green phase female, and she at this point, like at the time that she arrived, she was 800 grams, and my male was about 2,800 grams.
Holy crap!
So a huge, size difference, and so I was like, okay, I've got some time and some work to put in here to get this girl up to size to even be in the same ballpark as him, and so I started working on establishing her, and then a little while later, I got another female from the same folks, another imported female who's even smaller, 500 grams, and so the last few years have really been about getting those two females properly established and ready to breed with this big male, while simultaneously knowing that the clock is ticking with this male because, that when I got him back, he was already 11 years old. And because he is part of that first generation of sulphureus born in captivity, we don't actually really know their lifespan. He's going to be kind of the one to tell us. And but we do know a little bit more about Pilatus, and usually 12 to 14 is kind of what you can expect. So right now, that big sulphureus, he'll be 15 in 2 weeks. And still going strong. So it'll be interesting to see how long he goes. But anyway, now both of those females are much bigger. They're up around 2,000 grams. And the last couple years has been a kind of a project of trying to get them to breed and trying to get viable eggs. And the first 2 years in a row, I got, I received eggs from that green female, that slightly larger female, but they were infertile. And then last year, I received a clutch from her again, the third year in a row, and they looked a bit different. They looked like weird eggs. They were a little funky, but they were clearly different than the slugs I had received the 2 years prior, so I incubated them. And after 112 days of not hatching, and the eggs having dented for about a week without pipping, I cut an egg, and what I found was ultimately kind of deformed neonates. They were fully developed, but deformed, and that was true for all of those eggs. So that was a bit of a heartbreaker after so much time put in. And then this year, on August 2nd, I actually received clutches from both of the females. So the slightly smaller female on the exact same day. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, and they also nested in the same place. They nested together, which was really interesting. But it was interesting to receive eggs from both of them. So it's the first time that the smaller female is kind of a yellow, like more gold phase female. That's the first time she laid eggs for me. And she laid eggs about 6 hours before the other one did. And it was kind of a similar thing. It was kind of like, I'm not positive these are fertile. They look a little bit off, but I'm gonna put them in the incubator. And just this past week, those eggs hatched, and
yeah, I know. Congrats,
all
man.
11. Yeah, so all 11 of those eggs hatched, and yeah, so it's kind of a full circle moment here, you know, with sulphureus, and all signs indicate that male seemingly got the job done. I you know, I kind of, after that clutch last year, I had the feeling that those eggs may have been a result of parthenogenesis, just because of the way they were presenting. And a lot of people kind of had that same kind of hunch about it. I also just had never really witnessed courtship, or at least obvious signs of courtship. And so I kind of expected the same this year. And I don't think that's the case, just because all of these babies are so vigorous and healthy, and they all hatched. So yeah, that's a bit of a fire hose intro, but
yeah, that was good.
That's the full circle.
So
yeah,
the babies that you just received are the progeny of the first babies that you hatched.
Seemingly so, yeah.
Over a decade ago.
Be. Yep.
That's pretty badass story.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. So, with the sulphureus, I know that you're a big time naturalistic keeper. I know that, you know, your ethos for keeping is definitely more on the naturalistic side of things. Maybe not necessarily bioactive 100%, but naturalistic. And one of the things I teach my kids or my students is that I kind of feel like bioactivity is a good thing to strive for, but it's not always, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the, like, penultimate way of keeping things, because things like a 10-foot sulphureus, when it goes to the bathroom, you're going to need like 10 pounds of isopods to eat that Duke. Is that a fair statement?
Well, yes and no. So
yes and no. Okay.
Yeah. So I keep my adult trio, my 1.2 trio, in a big old honkin' vivarium. It's 8 foot by 3 foot by 6 foot, and it's fully decked out with you know, a universal rocks background, ledges and planters, and it's fully planted with species only native to or species that are native to Suriname, where the snakes are, you know, bloodlines originate from. And it's interesting because the first 6 months or so of having that vivarium set up and cycling, I did remove the majority of the waste from the snakes when they would scat. But at this stage, I actually don't. And I can see your expression. But yeah, so essentially what I do is I kind of cycle the scat into the soil layer of the vivarium, and there are a ton of springtails and isopods and microfauna in there, and it disappears. I mean, it becomes soil very quickly. And at this point, I mean, that vivarium, it's just to give an idea of how much, just the volume of substrate in there is extreme. So I recently moved, and moving that vivarium was twice as much work as moving all of my other vivariums combined. It was a huge task. And when I was removing the substrate, I got to the point where I had 12 5-gallon buckets full of substrate, and it looked like I hadn't removed even half of the substrate yet from the vivarium. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, how the hell did I get that much substrate in there in the first place? Like, I don't remember doing that. I don't remember it being this much substrate, but you know, I did put a bunch in there, and then over time also I was adding leaf litter. That thing, it is an engine, and it runs on leaf litter, you know. And you know, I get a garbage bag full of leaves in there, and I could do that once a month easily, and they just get digested by that vivarium. And so ultimately, it was about literally a pickup truck bed full of soil. And there's not quite that much in it now, but it is a lot of soil. So I think it's possible to do it that way. I haven't had any issues. I don't have issues with like smell or like, a super nitrogenous, nasty buildup in there or anything like that. It seems very healthy so far, but I'm also unsure of like what the long-term, carrying capacity is, at this point that vivarium's been up and running for 2 years at that and has been doing great. But at some point I might have to change, or I'll have to probably, remove a quantity of substrate and replace it, that kind of thing.
So that gets us to your way of keeping, which is these animals they're certainly not in rack systems. They're certainly not being kept in a PVC enclosure with stick here, stick there, hide box mulch.
Yeah.
So what was the driver for not necessarily keeping the snakes that either of those ways, and rather building this big naturalistic vivaria? Because I, like you, one of our definite similarities, you don't hear many people talk about how the emphasis of their collection is like South American colubrids. That just isn't like there's all people have North American colubrids. They have old world rat snakes, but I can only really think of you and me that have and I know there's more than us, but it's like kind of this foci on xenodontines is what many of them are, though yours is a colubrine. But basically, the South American region. So I know that has something to do with your naturalistic keeping. But what was your driver for basically saying, I'm not going to keep these the way that lots of people do. I'm going to keep them the way I want to, and that is going to be a naturalistic way. So, kind of talk through that process, because I think that this is really cool. Yeah.
So, I think that in some ways I've always been interested in that way of keeping, even back when I was a teenager keeping these snakes, I did still, in some ways in that time I was kind of doing things in a kind of avant-garde way for that time period, because I was still mixing my own substrates, not very different from the mixes I make now. I still was using leaf litter that I would collect outside. The whole bioactive wasn't a term that was in popular usage at that time at all, and but I was striving to create the most natural environment I could within, my extreme limitations at the time. And I think that having that background kind of as a naturalist, spending that 10 years away and really focusing on field herping a lot and just being out in nature a lot, I really just that's what's inspiring to me about working with reptiles is connecting with that. I think about the Amazon for me, I have an almost kind of it has an almost mystical reverence in my mind, as this is the cradle of the most biodiversity in the Western Hemisphere is here, and it's just it's just extraordinary to me to think about it and to imagine it, and just there's something enigmatic about that. And so I think that part of it is just seeking to replicate that, but also it's acknowledging that all of these animals exist in they're in a coevolutionary relationship with their surroundings, on some level, of course, and I think that there are interesting novel behaviors that you can observe if you strive for a higher level of natural replication and keeping. And for me as a reptile keeper, that's kind of my highest priority, actually, is providing the environments for my animals to express the broadest array of natural behaviors that I can see. And that's even higher for me than breeding and reproducing them is necessarily, although obviously that can be one of those natural behaviors that may emerge from that. And so, that's kind of the philosophy behind it, and it's definitely, it imposes limitations, totally different limitations.
No.
And I was so aware of that that was part of what I was really aware of when I was coming back to herpetoculture was like, I don't want to exceed my limitations the way that I did when I was a teenager and get in over my head. And so I want to kind of build up slow. I want to keep a smaller volume of animals, but I want to keep them in more interesting and elaborate displays. And I want part of the interest of keeping them to be maintaining the display. And so, that's kind of how it all has coalesced and tied in for me there.
Yeah, no, I can speak to that as well. I just like right there is my wall of Lamprepeltis, which obviously, if you're listening to this, you can't see it. But I kind of made a decision. I've talked about this before, where when I got back into this, kind of like you, I knew I wanted to do something with colubrids, and I did the old world rat snakes, and they just didn't work out. And I thought about the climate of my house, the humidity levels. I've got this kind of weird humidity thing going on, and I just was like, it's like always like Georgia here. And I thought, oh, Lamprepeltis gatula lives in Georgia. Let's just collect those. And so that's literally like bing, bang, boom. That was the thought process. But I have what's really interesting about my setup here at my home is that I've got this bank of naturalistic cages, and then I also have out in the other part of my collection is out of my garage, and it's a whole bunch of freedom breeder racks and bigger rack tubs, because I will never put something in a small tub, but they have space, but they don't have all the bells and whistles that these guys do, and I too, like you, absolutely 100%. Natural history is the driver of all things in my life professionally. Part of the reason why I jumped to crayfish from herpetology is back in the early 2000s, natural history was not the foci of the science at that time. Ironically, now it is, because we can, or it's come back as a foci because we have things like trail cameras and we have drones. We have all these ways to observe reptiles we didn't have before, where we can actually see novel behaviors. But early 2000s, if you were in graduate school, you were going to contemplate a PhD. You were going to do a PhD with phylogenetics, and it was going to involve going out, catching snakes, cutting their tail tips or ventral scales off, and then maybe throwing them in a jar, going to a museum, which I wasn't really into. But I wanted to study natural history. Having these enclosures in my house absolutely scratches that niche. And what's really cool is I've set these enclosures up the exact way that I saw the habitat for Florida king snakes when I was down around Belle Glade and in the cane fields, which is my favorite look. And obviously that's not a natural habitat, which also to me makes it a little bit more interesting because they are so successful there. But I took a video of it and I put it up on social media today. Like, I looked in my Hernando Florida king enclosure, and I purposely have it set up where there's a bunch of oat grass. I let it grow up and then die and then fall over. And the damn snakes are literally doing the cryptic basking coil just underneath the grass, but above the substrate, the exact way they do it out in nature. And like walking into my house in West Virginia and seeing what's going on potentially in Belle Glade, Florida, I hear a lot of people say, like, it's not the superior way of keeping. I'm not saying that. But I will say that it's more interesting. I do not get that experience when I pull the tub open. It doesn't happen. Totally. And so, given that I love and I geek about natural history, that's why keeping these things that way is to me far more rewarding, because I get to actually, like, see the snakes, and at some point we have to acknowledge that welfare is important. People get real apologetic when they talk about the way they keep, and I just feel like that way of keeping for the animals, they are able to exhibit behaviors they won't be able to exhibit, because the reason why the snake was doing what it was doing wasn't necessarily because there was grass. It was doing it because there's a light bulb in there that's giving it a little bit of UVA radiation so that it can actually like gain the heat and then move off to the other part of the enclosure. But, you know, having all of that in the box that you're keeping the snake in, it's just kind of cool. So, you know, my enclosure here has some mulch, some orchid bark, the oat grass, some honeysuckle branches from an invasive honeysuckle that's all over Appalachia that I like decimate in my yard and let them dry out, and then they go in the animal cages. And then some, dare I say it, at the risk of, you know, people judging me, some fake plants for the simple fact that the damn king snakes crap on everything, and I'm like, I need to be able to wash these things. But like, that's my setup. That is not what you have, though. Like, you have the Guyana shield is sitting, you know, in California. So talk a little bit about what exactly is in this vivarium. You know, as far as I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you were attempting a biotope. Is that correct? Yeah. So
Yeah,
explain what a biotope is, and just kind of talk about your setup with the plants and the lights and the rain and the everything.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, biotope. It's funny. It's like I feel a little cagey about these terms, like the biotope term and the bioactive term.
Yeah,
you know,
I feel cagey about them too. By the way, as I ask you to define them.
Totally. I know. We're in the same boat there, but because I just don't want to be like one of those guys that's like, this is what it is, you know. But
well, you didn't do it because it's called a biotope, but it just happens to be called a biotope, and you did it. So
exactly, and I actually didn't even know what a biotope. The biotope was a term when I was doing this until after I'd done it. But a biotope essentially is it's essentially building a vivarium where everything in it is seeking to be from a certain region or locality. Including the living plants. You know, some people would go so far as like trying to replicate the soil texture and composition, which is a little bit further than I would go personally. But so this big vivarium, I mean, actually, honestly, all the vivariums that I have set up are technically biotopes by that definition. Everything has plants native to where the species is from, and you know, I as a natural history geek, part of the joy of keeping things for me is like looking into the vivarium and seeing a little piece of that microhabitat that species occupies, and trying to replicate that as closely as I can. So in the case of the Spilotes vivarium, I've got over a dozen species of live plants in there. Some really big aeroids and some smaller little, vines and trailing plants, and some bromeliads mounted in the branches. There's a pretty big water bowl. I don't have like a running water feature, but I have a huge water bowl that the snakes can actually fit in if they want to. They don't really do that very often. Occasionally the big male will soak, but and then all these, rock ledges, and a network of manzanita branches for them to access just about every square inch of that vivarium. And then it's in terms of lighting, I've got I use Arcadia LED bars to light it, which produce a ton of light, which allows for that plant growth. Especially with such a tall vivarium, you need lights that can kind of penetrate a pretty good distance and still put out pretty high par to actually get good plant growth. And then there's also Arcadia T5s UVB on the snakes in there, the 6% bulbs, which are the rainforest bulbs. And then there are 3 separate basking kind of areas in the vivarium. I wanted the snakes to be able to bask independently if they wanted to actually have space from each other. I didn't want them to be competing for that resource. And so each of those basking areas has a large halogen alongside a deep heat projector that heats the vivarium. And It's interesting. Sometimes I will see the snakes perfectly, perfectly spaced out, basking, using those 3 separate areas, and sometimes I'll see them all coil up together in the same spot. It seems like, just depending on their mood to some extent. And then, it's also hooked up to a Mist King misting system that mists everything in that room. So I basically have what I call my tropical room. And in that room, I have species that are only native to the Guyana Shield region, which basically allows me to kind of set basic ambient parameters for the room itself, and then to supplementally add heat, basking opportunities and stuff like that. But the Mist King runs a few times a day, and I do replicate the wet and dry season using the Mist King. Throughout the year, I have basically a 52-week calendar that I follow.
Cool.
That tells me, okay, on this day I'm adjusting my lights. For my temperate species, I'll adjust my lights on my thermostat. So it's a nice gradual change. And with the tropical species, I adjust it for primarily the humidity and the misting, and I also pair that cycling alongside it. I do food cycling that aligns with that. So I offer a lot more food, or I offer more frequent small prey items during the so-called wet season, and less frequent larger prey items during the dry season. And I think that that's been part of what has been encouraging the females to cycle so consistently. Even if I haven't been getting the male, the triggers right for the male to breed, I have had really consistent results with the females cycling and producing eggs.
Gotcha. So feeding wise, you mentioned the food cycling, which is really cool. I gave that a go this year, more so than I normally do. So I'm kind of curious to see if it works for me. And I've always done that with the hydrodynastes, because the false water cobras, because I know the parts of South America, they actually have a pretty massive range across South America. But a lot of the places that they occur, and a lot of the places that we think our animals and herpetoculture came out of, absolutely they don't necessarily have winter, summer, but rather dry, wet, and then there's temperature fluctuations associated with that. But with the food cycling, what are you feeding them exactly? With these animals, I know they're arboreal, but I also know that they're found on the ground a little bit more often than people realize, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So what's the food like for them? Is it birds, mammals, fish, all the above, none of the above? Like, what is your approach to diet?
So I offer mine birds and rodents, pretty much exclusively. I have tried to offer lizards and reptilinks, like frog reptilinks and lizard reptilinks in the past, with no interest. In fact, I've actually had lizards in with those snakes in the same biotope. I've had turnip-tailed geckos native to that area, and also Uranoscodon superciliosus, the mop-hat iguanas, in there as well. And the snakes have had no interest in them whatsoever. Not tried to eat them. And the interesting thing about sulfurious is they have interesting ontogeny. So they go through an ontogenetic color change, but they also go through. They've developed two different kind of venom, two different toxins essentially over time. And you have soldotoxin, which is very impactful for lizards and for birds, and then you have solmotoxin, which is very impactful for rodents. And there's some people suggest that this is because when they're smaller, they may accept a diet of lizards more frequently when they're young. And then as they get larger, they will consume more rodents. And in my experience, I believe them to be nest raiders primarily, honestly, because just because of the way that they eat is unusual. It's if anyone's ever seen a Spilotes eat, it's very fast. They basically seize the prey and gobble it down as fast as they possibly can. And if that's a live prey item, they're not bothering to kill it first. Like it goes down kicking and screaming. I've seen, Sulfurious eat a live mouse or a live rat, and you can see the rat struggling as it's going down. And, I think that for me, that just does not make sense unless you're eating small, defenseless prey, as they would be if they're nest raiding. And that was actually kind of how I was able to get my my two females feeding consistently, because when they first came in, they were very good feeders at first, and then they kind of became picky, and it was really hard to get them to eat consistently for like a couple of years, honestly, of just like working at trying to get them to like actually get consistent on their feeding schedule. And they would eat, but it wasn't the way I wanted it to be. And so what I started doing was taking these large seed pods and putting them in the branches of the vivarium and putting in pigeon eggs or dove eggs, and I found that they would seek those out, find them, and just devour them. And then I would add in other prey items in there. I would add in a quail chick, add in a chick, chicken chick, and they would eat those as well with the eggs. And then the trick to then get them eating rodents as well. This is kind of this is one of those things that we do as a herpetoculturist where you're like doing it and you're like, what the hell am I doing right now? But but I ordered some collagen casing, like for sausage making, and I cut it into little strips, like little strings basically, and I tied a rat to a chick and put it in these seed pods, and they would get the chick and then keep going and eat the rat. And now, at this point, they'll eat anything that I put in those pods, or they'll even tongue feed now on
That's
anything. Cool. But, in their natural history, as far as we know, they're primarily bird and mammal eaters. I'm sure in South America, they're going to be getting much higher mammal diversity. They're going to be getting, I'm sure they're getting all kinds of like opossums and stuff like that, little arboreal marsupials, and but they do really well on a diet of rodents and avian prey. I think that like pretty much any snake, you can totally overfeed them, and I think a lot of people do tend to overfeed Spilotes. It's easy to do. They don't need to eat huge prey items. Like for my adults, like I said earlier, my male he's close to 11 feet long at this point, and he's over 10 pounds. And I don't give him anything larger than a medium rat. And he could eat a large rat, no problem, or an extra large rat, but I think that it's just not neat. He doesn't need it. He'll take one medium rat and maybe a chick, a chicken chick or a couple chicken chicks at a feeding, and that's a typical feeding for me with them. And that seems to keep them in a nice lean body condition, lean and healthy. You're not seeing a ton of scale separation in the posterior half of the snake, which for me is usually an indicator that they're being fed too much. So that's what I've been doing. It seems to be working pretty well for me. I think that you could feed them an exclusively rodent diet and you'd be fine. I think, but you'd probably have to be more careful about moderating that kind of diet if you're not also having a pretty substantial avian component, because I think that it's just a lot of fat.
Yeah.
For them.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, the things that we do that we don't realize we're ever going to do. Been there, done that.
I know, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I was, I think I mentioned this before, but my grad student pay, we were at the OCIC, and they are making sausages for indigo snakes. And here I am, I'm getting paid to go to Florida to take a meat cleaver and hack up frozen rats into cubes so we can put them in a sausage grinder and make rodent sausages. And it was just a totally normal day. That's just what we're gonna do. Yeah,
just what we do in the name of herpetoculture,
Exactly. And that was also the day that I found out that I have a sick, twisted fascination with taking meat cleavers and doing perfect cross sections of rodents and then, looking at them like a biology textbook. So, yeah, I learned something about myself that day, and I don't know if it was good. Anyway,
no judgment here.
Thank you. I have a question though about the venom, Duvernoy secretions is technically, I guess, what you would call that, but we can go with venom. I was shocked the first time I learned that Spilotes were rear-fanged and they actually had, biochemically active peptides in there. Yeah. Does Spilotes pilatus have that as well?
That's a question that I really want to know. As far as I know, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Which is weird.
Yeah, no,
I don't know of how too many genre that have species that one is. Can you think of any off the top of your head that one is venomous and one isn't? Yeah,
I mean there's some that have some medically not medically, but they produce peptides. Some of the Nerodia, I know, have more peptide activity going on back there than others. I don't want people thinking Nerodia are venomous. But Nerodia cipodon, common water snake, northern water snake, whatever you want to call it, it has heparin-like components in its salivary glands. That's why when you get bit by them, you just kind of seep and ooze blood because your platelets are basically just for pretty then. And I know, other species of Nerodia don't really have that. So, there's kind of that bit. But the thing, though, is, all the Nerodia kind of have the same dentition. But with Spilotes, it's odd that one has an enlarged, tooth, an epistoglyphus condition, and the other one apparently may or may not have that. So, yeah. Super cool. Have you ever been nipped?
Yes.
Did you have a reaction?
Yeah. So I have one story about that. I've been tagged a few times by them. I don't really handle them very much, particularly the wild caught ones. I don't like to mess with. The male is very mellow, like I said. I can totally take him out, but he doesn't like it. He resists, and so I don't do it really. But I have been tagged by the females a couple times, and one of the times in particular was interesting in that she got me on the digit of my thumb here, and immediately I felt some itchiness from the bite, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was like, this might get a little interesting here, and so I kind of was just keeping an eye on it, and it did swell a little bit. It wasn't crazy swelling, but it was definitely noticeably swollen in comparison to my other thumb. And then that subsided after a few hours. The interesting thing, though, that happened was that I had joint pain in the joint upstream of that in my thumb for 2 weeks. Oh, just a little bit of an ache in that joint. And that, I mean, it was one of those things where it was kind of is this even related? I don't really know, but it happened right after I got bitten by the snake, and then it just went away by itself after a couple of weeks or whatever. And it was just this very mild, just that's kind of weird. A little bit of stiffness and pain in that joint. That's kind of the only thing I've had. I've never let one just chew on me. and it would be very unpleasant, I'm sure. But there's some interesting papers. There's a couple papers actually now from Steve Mackesy. I think University of Northern Colorado has been doing some really interesting work on them. I've got links to those in my article on Spilotes on my website for anyone who might be interested in checking those out. It's really interesting stuff. I remember like there's some interesting like there's this interesting thing I think about like the impact of their venom on like a hemidactylus gecko was like really extreme or something like that. And I remember being like, well, they don't live with hemidactylus, so like, that makes a lot of sense. But anyway, it's a species that I don't treat them the same way I would treat necessarily like a Thrassops, or or something like that. But I definitely have respect for them. I don't just let them bite me. I avoid it as much as I can.
That's probably fair. I don't. I learned a lot about Duvernoy's glands and rear fang delivery systems and like basically a lot of these animals, the peptides they're making, if they were more efficient in the delivery of the toxins, we would be treating them like freaking rattlesnakes and mambas, and but the fact is they just have, this is a fun show, the derpiest way of delivering venom ever. It's kind of like throwing it at the prey item in a manner of speaking, because it's not contained in a tube. It's kind of oozing out of this Duvernoy's gland into a groove, and they have to chew it in. It's like, and then all the extra fluids in their mouth are diluting it, and so
unsophisticated.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very, very unsophisticated. And then others are sophisticated, but in the case of these guys, unsophisticated. So, no, that's super cool. So I know one of the other things I want to talk about, kind of on this, line of thought, before we get to your babies and all that. I know you've mentioned. I want to kind of go back to the naturalist perspective. I'm a weird age to be a naturalist because I'm in my early 40s. So, I was raised on field guides, books, articles, and then these computer things showed up, and then the internet came along, and now I have a freaking computer in my pocket with my cell phone. But you'd think I'd be all over all the natural history apps, and it's not that I'm averse to them. It's just so foreign to me to have somebody actually care about what the hell I'm seeing outside that's nerdy as hell. That's a whole new concept. But also sharing it and communicating. And of course I'm kind of leading into iNat. I wrote that paper where I talked about how if you're going to keep things with a natural history basis, there's all these tools we have, and ironically, and one of those things I said was iNat, and you can go on and you can look at observations and blah, 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 and then I find myself not doing it, even though I told the whole world to do it. But I know that you do it, and I've been listening to your podcast, which is I already told you this, I'm going to say it one more time, Project Herpetology. It's Roy and Phil's podcast. Absolutely fantastic. So, yes, that is a plug. Go listen to it. It's in the Animals at Home network. Please don't hurt me, Eric. So, we're plugging the other network. But anyway, it's a good one. It's a solid podcast. And you've mentioned how you've seen things in your enclosures that were then validated on iNat. So, talk a little bit about just what does iNat have a role in herpetoculture? And it obviously does. But what do you think it is? And in case you don't know what iNat is, the younger people are like, you have to explain this. The older people are like, what the hell is that? That might be listening to this. iNaturalist is iNat, and it's a wonderful, started off as a citizen scientist platform where basically everybody walks around with a camera in their pocket now. So you can go, you take your picture, you have an iNat account just like you have an Instagram account or a Facebook account, only it's very different in that you can upload observations. And then there's this iNat community of experts. I'm one of the experts for crayfish, obviously, that then kind of come by and validate and ID the animals for you. And it creates this kind of digital community of naturalists, which, if you really think about what I just said, there's a little bit of an oxymoron there, because naturalists want to be out away from the digital world, yet this community is entirely digital. Like that whole Nexus world is interesting to me, it can be used in a herpetocultural way. So I want you to, if you don't mind, just kind of discuss how you've used it, especially with the sulphurus and your large enclosure, and like behaviors that you've kind of seen them do and validate with iNat. Just kind of word vomit on that for a little bit.
Of course, I can go for that. So, I mean, iNaturalist, I love that platform. I think it's a really useful tool. You can actually, one thing that I highly recommend folks do for herpetoculture is you can actually subscribe to a taxon on iNaturalist. And so what you do is you can subscribe, say, to Spilotes sulphureus, and then every time a new observation of Spilotes sulphureus gets posted to iNaturalist, you get a notification on your dashboard that says here's a new observation. And so I've just subscribed to all the species that I work with and a bunch of other stuff that I'm interested in. And then it's kind of like my morning coffee routine. A lot of the time I'll sit there drinking my coffee and scrolling through the iNaturalist observations and just seeing what's there. And it's also something I do when I'm like beginning to work with a new species, or I'm in research about a species. I go through and I just look at all the observations on iNaturalist. You can kind of select a couple of different viewing formats of the actual observations themselves. One's like a grid that's just all the pictures essentially. And you can interpret a lot from that. And of course you can misinterpret a lot from it as well. So there's always that danger, but I think that if you're using some discernment, you can interpret a lot of valuable stuff to be applied to herpetoculture. So like one example, this is not the Spilotes, but I'll get to that in a second, is I keep a genus of lizards, Polycris, which is another species native to the Guyana Shield. And I observed multiple times on iNaturalist these lizards eating stick insects, huge stick insects. I tried feeding them stick insects and got the most extreme feeding response I've ever had from them, which was a really cool thing to put together.
Cool.
With the Spilotes, I used iNaturalist to inform which plant species I was selecting for the vivarium. So you can go in the search format on iNaturalist, you can narrow it down to a certain region and then type in, say, a certain family of plants. So you can type in aeroids of the Guyana Shield or aeroids in Suriname, and you'll just get observations of all the aeroid species in Suriname. So then you've got a plant list. Okay, which species of these can I even obtain, in horticulture, and buy? And so I did that with a bunch of different families of plants for the vivarium, and interestingly, one of them was bromeliads. So when I was first getting the Spilotes, I had them in a naturalistic vivarium. It had live plants. Most of them were neotropical, but they weren't specifically from the Guyana Shield. And then when I was moving them into this big vivarium, I had the intention of really doing only things native to the Guyana Shield. And so I ordered a bunch of plants, and among those was a large bromeliad that I was mounting in all of the branches. And interesting about bromeliads is they have what's called an axil, which is essentially it's like the center of the plant forms a reservoir. And famously, like dart frogs will raise their tadpoles in this reservoir of water up in the trees. And after introducing the snakes into this new vivarium with the bromeliads, I noticed that both of the wild-caught female sulphureus were going around to all the bromeliads and drinking water out of them. Like, they were like, oh, that's what these are for. I remember these. That was my interpretation, on some level. that was the vibe I was getting from what they were doing. I was like, oh, they know what they're doing. They're looking for water out of these things, and they are drinking regularly out of them. And so it was just like such an amazing observation at the time that it happened. You know, it was one of those moments like you described, you know, seeing your Florida king cryptic basking under the oak grass. You know, for me, it was like the same kind of thing. Just like, hell yes, that is why I do this. You know, that is the good stuff.
Yeah.
You know, seeing that kind of behavior. And it also kind of like solved a problem for me in some ways, in that like, where are these like large arboreal snakes getting their water? You know, I mean, obviously they're drinking it from dew and rain, collecting on their scales, collecting on leaves, but like, you know, that's not happening all the time necessarily. And so it kind of makes some sense that, you know, these large arboreal snakes would be seeking water out of these things that actually have a reservoir that would have water long after it's dried up in other places. And the really cool thing about this story is that just in the last couple months, this observation that I had in my vivariums was validated on iNaturalist, because someone had gone and ID'd an old observation of what turned out to be a Spilotes sulphureus drinking out of a bromeliad. And I was like, yes, you know, and it was also interesting because, you know, I think that if I had seen that observation, I wouldn't necessarily have known what it was doing. You know, it's like, it's just this picture of a snake with its head down in a bromeliad. And I probably would have been like, oh, maybe it's looking for frogs, or like maybe it's foraging in some way. You know, I wouldn't have necessarily known, oh, it's drinking. That's what it's doing. And sure enough, there it was. I was like, that's what it's all about right there. So
yeah, no, little moments like that are they make it all worthwhile. I've had a million of those kind of things outside of herpetology, just, you know, doing the field-based work that I do, and in herpetology. Like I said, I'm nerding out. You know, most people would be like, it's coiled underneath a plant, but like if you do the due diligence and you read and you observe and you're basically engaged, you realize that there's so much more nuance to everything that they're doing than we realize. So, yeah, no. And then when you get that replicated in your enclosure, that's just like you said, that's the good stuff. That's literally what. Yeah,
another.
You know, why I do what I do. And why you do what you do.
One of my favorites with that was, I think I sent this to you a long time ago, but there's this research paper that I've read a few times in kind of studying up on the Xenodon, the tricolors, and it's like annual activity patterns of snakes in the Cordoba region of Argentina, and it has like, you know, graphs charting. Yeah, you know the paper.
I know that paper.
And it shows, you know, the spike in activity, you know, and observations that you see of these snakes. And of course, it's right when amphibians are breeding and there's lots of rain and water. But also, if you go on iNaturalist, you can actually look at you can look at annual trends of the observations, and the observations on iNaturalist perfectly matches the exact same spike in the graph. It's just like, yeah, of course, you know, obviously it's so obvious, you know, that, that's when you're going to see these snakes that are fossorial, you know, just when there's tons of food and it's nice and wet, they're out. It's a good time to be out in the open. If you're a fossorial snake in the Chaco, but, I just love that kind of stuff. It's so fun.
Yeah, no, totally. Okay. So back to the keeping for keeping's sake. Now you have all these little ones.
Yeah.
It's been a while. Do you have a plan of attack? I mean, and since you bred the sulphureus back in the day, I know that other people have bred them. So has like the husbandry of neonate husbandry had come along since what, 15, 16, however many years ago it was that you brought in, you know, got
it's
the female that dropped the eggs?
That was like a big deal when I got those eggs. Was like, how are the neonates going to be? Is this going to be a total nightmare? And I figured out a kind of a trick to get them to feed that is the trick that everyone uses now. You know, and I figured it out then just tinkering on my own, you know, and I'm sure that that's how Jason Hood and others figured it out too, is trying stuff and seeing what sticks. And,
Yeah.
but essentially if you can kind of get them to start feeding by tease feeding essentially. And that usually looks like, you know, grasping a baby in the hand, you know, so there's about 6 inches of snake out, enough for them to kind of, you know, coil and form a striking coil. And you kind of wiggle a pinky on tongs in front of them until they bite. And then usually they bite it, and then maybe a couple times they'll bite and they'll let go. And then eventually they'll bite it and they'll just grab it and then eat it. And just, that's all it takes, really.
Golf.
They're really not that hard to get going. Using that technique, and especially once they've done that a few times, it's no longer necessary to like restrain them to do it. They recognize it's food and they'll grab it off the tongs, in my experience. So that's what I'm going to be doing this time. You know, right now the babies none of them have had their first shed yet. They're all just now beginning to go into the blue for that first shed. But as soon as they've done that, I'll start feeding trials with that technique. I know that Jason has also had some success using quail, like day-old quail, for some of the stubborn feeders, I think. And yeah, in terms of how I'm going to set up the babies, how I do the rearing of pretty much everything here is pretty much the same as the adults. They go into pretty complex setups. You can kind of see, for those that have you can see the video behind me, those are nursery setups behind me with the lights just turned off there. And those little dark blobs you can see, those are baby Spilotes coiled up in the branches. Yeah, and so
that's really cool.
Yeah, they have little nano halogen for heat, overhead heat, and they have LED and T5 lighting over the top. They get some UV exposure, and yeah, that's just like how I like to raise stuff here. You know, as much as I can. Of course, there's you know, practical limitations. Again, you know, you can't. It's not like I can put every single one into like a 24-inch cube or whatever. But there's some enclosure manufacturers that have made some nice, like Tamura Designs is one that I really like for nursery enclosures. He basically makes these like condo setups, you know, so it's like multiple enclosures in one kind of PVC display, and that's how I raise my babies here, both the Spilotes and also like the lizards, the Polycris, and everything. And cool. Yeah, I'm excited to get into raising these ones up and see. I mean, the ones that I raised as a teenager, they were easy. I had no trouble with them at all while I had them. I think I lost one of the 8 that I hatched. I think kind of died unexpectedly, as I recall. But it had been eating and everything just fine. I don't know, maybe they got a bad mouse or something, but it was like a pretty just out of the blue kind of thing. But other than that, I remember them being really sturdy. And I mean, that's just true in general. I think of captive born Spilotes is that they're really not that hard as captive born. People sometimes reach out to me and are like, "What do you do with your wild caught? What's your protocol?" And I'm totally willing and happy to share, you know, and do generously. But I'm also like,
cool.
If you're thinking about getting one, get one from Jason Hood. Like, get a captive bred one. You're going to save yourself a lot of headaches doing that. They're just so much more enjoyable to work with when they want to feed and they're not terrified of you. And I think that they also are more amenable to being kept in kind of simpler setups that way. And smaller setups. I think that, when I had my adults now, at one point I had them in smaller setups, like 4x2x3 size setups. And I never saw them. The females would hide all the time. Now that they're in the 8x3x6, they are out constantly. Like it's rare that they're hiding. They're display snakes.
Really?
They're just out basking. And I think a lot of that is just because they have more space. They feel like they can move away. And part of that is having a full extra foot of depth. It's going from a 2-foot depth to a 3-foot depth in the vivarium. And for a species whose primary means of escape is flight, I think that really matters, because they can sense, like, I've got some space to move here. Whereas, in a 2-foot vivarium, if I'm standing right in front of the vivarium, they pretty much feel cornered. And, so I think that, again, if you are going to go with wild caught, I think that they actually do better in larger, more complex setups, or in very simple, like opaque tub style setups, because I think in that environment, you're basically creating a sensory deprivation chamber, You're reducing stimulus so much that they can kind of settle out a little bit, but the kind of in-between place of keeping them in kind of like a big-ish vivarium doesn't usually work super well with wild caught, in my experience. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, with how do I ask this question? I don't like the idea of beginner snakes. That's never been something that I've kind of gotten into. But at the same time, 11 feet of snarky colubrid is a lot. So it is. Before the show started, you'd mentioned that you've kept Spilotes pilatus. Do you think that pilatus is like, work with those, then go to the big boy, or do you think that
I honestly think they're really similar. I think they're really similar. Pull the trigger and go, I would say.
Okay.
I think that wild caught pilatus are probably a bit easier, but in terms of the captive born, I think you could go right for sulphureus. I think. Pilatus are a bit smaller typically, although the guy on the shield pilatus that come in get really big too. They get up 10 feet. The northern, localities of pilatus, which are probably not even pilatus, they're a separate species. I'm sure it just needs to be revised.
Yeah.
They're a bit smaller, but still, an 8 or 9 foot snake you can expect from those. Although the difference, I'm kind of shocked at the difference between like a 9 foot sulphureus and an 11 foot sulphureus, in terms of like it's a big difference, like in weight, especially like the male that I have he's massive. Like I've never seen another colubrid like him, other than some of the really big Drymarchon or really big Hydrodynastes. Those are kind of the only things that have a similar affect of just like, holy crap, that's a serious colubrid. Tias carinatus is another one.
Yeah.
But there are very few that have that kind of presentation. I think I agree with you around the whole idea of beginner snakes. It's like, it's definitely a species that, anyone dedicated can work with them, right? But part of the dedication to them is space, and that's a huge one. That's a huge limiting factor when working with a species like this, is just how big they are and how active they are.
Gotcha. Okay, so I guess I have a couple more questions, but we were going to talk about Phreonex and pilatus, but we're kind of running out of time here, and I feel like it's just worth having you come back on a couple more times, because it's been nice having somebody on that's both a naturalistic keeper and interested in American snakes. Like Matt has a lot of friends with his old worlds, and I love you guys that have come on, but it's just been kind of refreshing to have an episode of South American origin. I think this might be the first one where that's kind of the focus of the group that we're talking about. But I got way ahead of myself and just kind of reared into it. Yeah. So we've got 2 questions. We ask all our guests these, so we're going to kind of do a hard 90. But why colubrids? What is it like? What about colubrids specifically drew you in? versus a ball python, not ball python, but pythons. Yeah. I mean, boas are all over the Americas. You've got plenty Epicrates and boa and Eunyctes and all those guys. But why is Roy not keeping rainbow boas and he's keeping giant? Why aren't you keeping 11-foot yellow anacondas and instead you're keeping 11-foot sulfurias?
I'm sure part of it is just like superficial, just like I like the way they look. I really love the body plan of Spilotes. They're just really beautiful snakes. They've got really interesting features. They've got an interesting threat display. But a lot of it, I think, I kept Corrales in the past. I had Amazon tree boas at one point, and I've kept a lot of other stuff. But colubrids are just, colubrids, dipsadids. That's what really interests me. It's something about just their behaviors. I think also there's something about just the diversity expressed within those families. There's just so much going on, and so many different body plans and different niches that they're fulfilling and occupying. And like really, there are some colubrids that don't do it for me. I mean, I love all snakes, but there's plenty of stuff that I wouldn't really be interested in keeping. And there's something about the Spilotes, though. I think that one of the things I really like about them is they're so polymorphic. There's so many different color variations and pattern variations in Spilotes that it's really hard to even pin down, and there's this kind of fun thing that happens with the ontogenetic color change where it's like all the babies pretty much look the same and there's black and gray snakes and you do not know what they're going to look like, really. The parents give some indication of how they'll probably look, but like my male is a good example. Like I don't know what the sire looked like for him, it was a wild snake, but the dam that produced him was green with a yellow head and a black tail. And this male that I have, he's like jet inky black with like bright highlighter yellow markings. They don't look alike at all. So it's really interesting to see that kind of variation emerge in a species, and I think that's like part of what I like about them. But yeah, I think also just like colubrids, they seem a little bit more dynamic and active, I think, than a lot of the boas and pythons. They express more kind of like foraging behaviors, more kind of active moving behaviors and stuff like that I just like, as a behavior nerd, natural history nerd, that stuff gets me stoked to see. I like to see the animal moving around and expressing its natural repertoire, and I also, there's something about like, looking at a nice, chondro or emerald tree boa, but it's most of the time that you're awake, it's just sitting on a branch, and it's amazing. It looks really good sitting there on that branch. Don't get me wrong, I like it, but it doesn't interest me in the same way. I really like to see them actively foraging. Like, it's so cool to watch the Spilotes moving through and putting fresh eggs in one of their little seed pods, and then one of them smells it, and then they start cruising, and they're looking, and they find them and devour the eggs. That kind of thing is just really interesting to watch for me, and I think a big part of what draws me to colubrids is just they're more naturally active usually. Yeah.
Cool. All right, and then okay, last question before we wrap it up. The future of herpetoculture. Is it bright? Is it not bright? From a colubrid-centric point of view, what do you think the next 5-10 years is going to look like? Do you think that this naturalistic keeping, a lot of people have noticed and have kind of discussed the fact that just 5 years ago there was kind of an I don't want to say an aversion, that's not the right word, but there was, at least in mainstream herpetoculture, there was a resistance if there was anything to naturalistic, bioactive. It was kind of like poo-pooed, and now in certain circles, in other circles, it was of course openly embraced. So I don't want to give the impression like it wasn't, but it does seem like in snake land, where we have a tendency to really kind of here in the Americas, in the United States, the economical keeping, as I say in my herpetology lectures, i.e. racks, newspaper, water bowl, hide. There seems to, not necessarily that's being abandoned, but there does seem to be more of a kind of working towards a middle ground. Not necessarily an 8 foot long, 6 foot tall, 3 foot deep, perfect replication of the Guyana shield. But, we're going to have a PVC enclosure with mulch, some sticks, various cage furniture, a thermo gradient, for the corn snake, if you're keeping a handful of animals. But I want to know what your thoughts are on this, and obviously one more plug for Roy's podcast, because you've pontificated about this exact topic, I think, more times than I can count. So, I know you're ready for this one.
My thoughts
what are your thoughts on that?
That we're moving in that direction. I think that we're moving toward embracing a little bit more complexity in the way that we're keeping these animals. I think that, honestly, I think a lot of it has to do with just kind of increasing awareness around welfare and the complexity of herpetofauna. They're such stoic creatures, and I think that in many ways, because of that, they will endure a lot, and they have endured a lot in captivity over the decades that we've been doing herpetoculture. And I think that as people are becoming more aware of that complexity, there's more of an imperative to like kind of consider, what is the implication of that, of a snake that just lives in a opaque tub its whole life versus one that has, like what you described, a slightly more enriched environment. And the studies that have been done, however limited they are up to this point, are not really ambiguous about that at all. From what I can tell, that it's better for the mental well-being of the snake to be in a slightly more complex environment. And I think that one thing that I'm observing with this too is that I think that people are starting to keep for different reasons in some ways. Like you mentioned our podcast, Project Herpetoculture. Every episode closes with asking our guest, why herpetoculture? Like, why do you do this? And part of the reason for that is because I think that there's actually a myriad of reasons why people are doing it that are really different from each other, and sometimes I think that we don't really recognize that very well as a community. We can kind of get into this picking sides and battling one another, and I think that it's like, there's room for diversity. There's room for all of it. It doesn't have to be contentious necessarily. And so I think that
100%.
I see a lot more people that are like, they're just keeping stuff because they're interested in natural history, and they like want a slice of nature in their home, and because of that, they're striving for more kind of natural replication. And it's definitely also, I think, being impacted at this point by like social media and that is a whole weird thing, that like, who knows where we're going with that in a lot of ways. I feel like I have really mixed feelings about it, but it's definitely true that like, a lot of prominent keepers, and people in the herp community on social media have gotten a lot of criticism and flack for the way that they've kept, and are kind of trending generally in the direction of more naturalistic keeping and kind of advocating for more naturalistic keeping for their animals, and that others should do the same. And I think that matters, as much as like I despise that the term influencer is even a fucking thing. Sorry to cuss, but I had to throw that in there.
Yep. That's all right.
That's like
okay.
That's just such
Right
an
there with
absurd
you.
thing to me. But at the same time, it's like this is the world we're living in, and they're called influencers for a reason. And
Yep.
and yeah, it seems like that seems like the general trend. And I think that also it's like I think that in some ways that it does dovetail a little bit with the criticism and the kind of opposition that herpetoculture has experienced as a whole, where we're seeing more and more legislation. And, the reality is that, like, for the opposition to herpetoculture, there's no better ammunition than showing pictures of a bunch of snakes in tubs, or the optics are bad, essentially, and whether or not you agree,
you can at some point you had to understand that
exactly
people don't understand that we don't keep puppies in tubs. We don't keep gerbils in tubs. We don't keep the bunny rabbit in a tub. So why the hell are you keeping the snake in the tub? And I'm not anti-tub.
Totally.
There's literally tubs in this room I'm sitting in right now. They serve a purpose. But what we're talking about are the people who are trying to take these things away from us. and But at the same time, I'm totally anti-false water cobra in a tub. I know a couple people that do it, and I just personally, like, on podcasts, a lot of times people say, you can do what you want to do. Don't keep a false water cobra in a tub. I can't say that is okay. They defecate too much. The air exchange isn't going to be good for them. They're so freaking active. They respond to light, like they actively bask. Where they live, it's an open habitat. So, like, at some point, I feel, and I know I'm getting ranty, but that's okay. I think on this particular topic, at some point we do, as a community, need to be able to take some constructive criticism from within and understand that change is good. Like, it's just doing things the way we always did them, or doing it because it's economical. It's great optics for the people that want to take this away from us.
Well said. And I think also it's just to be like totally real about it. It's like change is coming. Like you can resist change all you want, but like the act of resistance is itself a change. It's like
exactly.
It's kind of like standing up against the rising of the tide at a certain point, where change is on the way, and we can either, as a community, it seems like we can kind of embrace it and try to be a little bit more unified in that, and put up a unified front, put our best foot forward, and stand a chance, or we can have people who are not stakeholders at all make the changes for us, and that's the last thing we want, because they're not stakeholders. They don't know why we're doing this thing. They don't know what it means to us, and frankly, they don't really care.
No, they have no idea why. Yeah, anybody wants to have 100 snakes in their house. Like, we have all had that moment, myself included, on several occasions. And it's weird because the ecosystem I dwell in is a biology building where I'm teaching young people who are coming from all over the country to learn how to do this. So it's like keeping reptiles and herpetoculture now it's an overwhelming part of my world. And when I get out of that world and I'm in I'm doing air quotes, Roy can see them, normal land, and someone asks me, like, what do you do? Great example. I got a haircut 2 weeks ago. And I'm sitting there, and I don't like to talk to people when I'm getting a haircut. I am an introvert, which a lot of people don't realize, and I just want to sit there. Please cut my hair. I'm not going to be a douchebag about it, but we don't need to have a deep conversation about anything. Just cut my hair. And I'm sitting there, and the reason why is I know it's coming, because it always starts with, so what do you do? And I'm like, well, shit. Like, that's what I think. I'm a biology professor at West Liberty, which is, of course, the local university. Then, well, what do you teach? And I always say I teach all the animal classes. And then it goes to, well, you know anything about that zoo sci major? Or they do something with zoos up there? And I'm like, yeah, I'm the guy in charge of it. And somehow the conversation's going to lead to snakes. And when it leads to snakes, in that space, I'm no longer in my safe space of the science building. I'm no longer surrounded by the snake nerds. I'm out in the open and I'm exposed. And it begins. Well, do you have any snakes? I'm like, yeah, I do. Well, and I always say I have a few. You know, I don't want to say I got 80. And then the whole, good. You have snakes? What do you mean you have snakes? Wow, like, and that's the response that a lot of us get. And then here in West Virginia, it oftentimes leads to one of two things. And I am happy to say it doesn't happen as often as it used to. It used to be 100% of the time. But this was one of those examples. I killed this snake and I killed that snake. And it's just like, oh, God, I have to sit here and I can't, like, retaliate the way I want to. But those are the people that when they hear I have 80 snakes in my house, turn around and are like, this guy's a total fruitcake. So, you know, the optics of how we're keeping them and everything, when we already have that public image to deal with, it does matter. At some point, we need to acknowledge that matters. And if you walk into to a person's collection and it's immaculate and you've got a piece of the rainforest or the piece of the Everglades or whatever, and it's, you know, I don't care who you are, people look at that and go, wow, that's cool. I mean, I've had a lot of people walk into this office and go, whoa, this is what it means to keep snakes. And I think that optic, it can shut down the fear factor, which is obviously what we're fighting when it comes to people adding regulations and things to us very, very quickly. And then we have the chance to slide and do something that's very precious to me, which is educate, educate, educate. When I'm sitting there hearing about how you killed 5 totally harmless, absolutely wonderful Pantherophis alleghaniensis black rat snakes, and I have an innate reaction I'm not going to say in a recording.
I can read between the lines.
To that. But, you can't lash out, because if you lash out, then you're playing to the stereotype that he's the crazy snake guy. So we have all that to fight off and deal with. By all means, having nice enclosures and that being the public face of this is great. Now, what's really interesting is, like, in zoos, there's the exhibitry that you see in zoos, but sterile keeping is the way, like, as much as we don't like it, if you've got to produce hundreds of indigo snakes, you can't have 10 by 3 by 4 foot vivs and all that kind of stuff. You have to incorporate very large tubs and more of an economical approach. Conservation, there is a purpose for that. But I think that the front-facing view of herpetoculture, the naturalistic side of keeping, is absolutely going to do us nothing but good. I mean, getting away from snakes, I can tell you right now, I've seen some dart frog vivs in the past 6 months that were like, I don't care who you are. If you saw those and then realized, like, that's part of herpetoculture, those vivaria are going to they're going to generate fascination and awe, which is what we need. We don't need resentment and fear.
Absolutely.
So. Rant.
And that's I've had that experience so many times at this point, where people are like, oh, you keep snakes? Like, oh, can I see? And they've got kind of like this gross look on their face. The wince, like
the wince.
But there's disgust, but there's also curiosity. They're side by side, and as soon as they see holy crap, it's like vivarium, you know, and these huge, beautiful snakes out basking. They're like, whoa, this is amazing. You know, like, you know, I like the place I was living before. They were just down in the basement of the farmhouse, you know, and people would be like, you want to go down to the basement? And they're like, oh God, what's this going to be like? They're like, this is going to be weird. This is going to be really creepy. And then they come down there, they're like, oh my God, this is like Cal Academy, you know? And it's like, yeah, it's cool. It's like,
nice.
That's what and then for me, like just like you said, you know, as like someone who cares about the education opponent, it's like I'm like, okay, now's my moment. I can make my pitch, you know, for like why this matters, why this is important, and like, yeah, it's like that's all it takes, you know. It's the same thing, you know. I do work with like, you know, rattlesnake conflict mitigation stuff, and it's the same thing, you know, like you said. Oh, I killed 10 of those last year, you know? And for me, it's like, I'm always just looking for like, okay, where is that little bit where there's like a little bit of there's the fear, there's the disgust, but there's always a little bit of curiosity and fascination too. And it's like, if you can get that and just like leverage that a little bit and pry it open, that's where the change can happen, you know? And, yeah, I agree. It's like, we talk a lot on our podcast about the dart frog community and also like reef tanks, you know. It's like the connotations of those are so different, you know, as they relate to how the outsider, you know, perceives it. And I think that we could use a little bit more of that as a community. It would do us good.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was great. Thoroughly enjoyed having you on, man. You'll definitely, if the invitation will be there
great,
to talk about other
Anytime.
things, just so
really
you know.
Appreciate it.
So if people want to get a hold of you,
so you can find me
how
on
do they
Facebook.
go about doing that?
Roy Blodgett is my name. I'm also on Instagram at Wellspring Herpetoculture. I have a Wellspring Herpetoculture page there. If you want to like or follow that on Facebook and not be my friend, that's fine too. And I post probably more regularly on Instagram because I like to take photos of everything and post little videos and stuff like that. So that's probably the best place. And yeah, you can catch our podcast at Project Herpetoculture.
Yep.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you, sir, for coming on. This was great. And you can find me at Zach Loafman on Facebook. Look me up online. I'm always looking for grad students who are into this thing. And if you're listening to this and you're in high school and you want to go to college and literally work with snakes every day you're in school, hit me up for that as well, because we have our Zoosci undergraduate degree. And I don't ever plug that. I always plug for grad students. But you know, we have students from literally all over the country doing that. And over 400 individual animals on campus. So, including Spilotes pilatus. We don't have sulphurus. Well, we have the other guy. In fact, one of our male is it's really funny. We got the male, and I thought he was big, and then I hadn't really worked with him for a couple years, and now he's big. He was not big before. I mean, he's an 8, maybe 9 foot monster. Anyway. You can also find me on Instagram at Dr. Crawdad. And then Matt, even though he wasn't here in person, he's always here in spirit. You can find him at Serpamitra. I know that Matt has stopped shipping until after the holiday season. So there is that piece. And we're doing this right before Thanksgiving, so have a happy Turkey Day, and be sure to eat your theropod, i.e. dinosaur. So that's what I tell all my students at West Liberty. So with that being said, have a happy. See ya.